Hey, thank you so much for listening to Reversing Climate Change. This is Ross Kenyon. I'm the host of the show. This show is sponsored by Philip Lee LLP. Philip Lee LLP is a law firm with a lot of experience in carbon markets and carbon removal. If you've been working in this space for really any amount of time, you probably have noticed that you do need competent counsel to do business here. The contracts that get signed are frankly pretty weird. You're going to need help from a lawyer with a red pen. I'm sorry to inform you, your only choice is basically who they should be. And if you are deciding who they should be, you should be considering Philip Lee LLP. They've won Environmental Finance's VCM Law Firm of the Year for the last, since 2023, essentially. It hasn't happened yet for 2026. I imagine they're a contender for it this year as well. They are the largest legal team dedicated to the financing and development of carbon projects globally, and they have offices in the US, Europe, and the UK. One cool new thing I just learned, actually, is that they have been listed as a firm in Chambers Global as a global market leader in the area of climate change. This listing aligns Philip Lee LLP with around 15 to 20 of the leading law firms practicing in this practice area in the entire world. So congrats to Philip Lee LLP. Thank you to Philip Lee LLP for your generous support of the show. You make it possible for me to dedicate so much time to putting out content that I hope is useful to our friends and peers and fellow travelers in the world of carbon removal, climate change, and carbon markets. Thanks so much. Here's the show. Hey, you are listening to Reversing Climate Change. I am Ross Kenyon. I'm really happy to have you listening. I am a climate tech and carbon dioxide removal entrepreneur. Before I introduce today's guest, if you could please open up your podcast app, give this show a full rating, which is often 5 stars. On Apple Podcasts, you are also able to write a review, which is super helpful. I would very much appreciate it if you could write a quick review of this show, telling everyone how much you enjoy it. In case you aren't aware, I've been doing a Substack. So if you want to get full transcripts of shows, some secondary materials and analysis from the show, that's also available on Substack, the link to which is in the show notes. Today's guest is Martin Freimüller. That's me trying to work with that umlaut, Freimüller. Martin, your ancestors were millers who had asserted their customary rights against the feudal landowners and the gentry who seek to tie them to their mills. Lots of respect. But more recently, I guess, Martin is the co-founder and CEO of Octavia Carbon. Octavia is a direct air capture company in Kenya. Martin's a longtime listener and someone that I really respect. And he thought I had potentially made a wrong turn. Being the sort of grumpy Gus that I've been lately, he's seeing some opportunities that our industry has overlooked in carbon dioxide removal, some of which involves the rhetorical way that we position ourselves against the registries that precede the dedicated carbon removal registries like Puro, like Isometric, like my former company, Nori, Rainbow, and thinks actually it's time for carbon removal to come on home. Carbon removal is the prodigal son. Without Microsoft, maybe we're a little bit over our skis. While the VCM as a whole still has a fair amount of health within it. So I really appreciated Martin being creative about how to find overlooked opportunities and also being generous enough to share that with everyone listening. I think we have a really real conversation about this moment we're in and what it takes to get our bizarre little industry to where it needs to go. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoy. Martin, you're back. It's been some amount of time, and you're here to tell me about why I'm wrong and foolish about everything that I believe. Why are you doing this to me?
Because you're always foolish, and I just have this intrinsic need to call that out. Sorry.
No, it's I really appreciate engaging with you. Thanks for listening and taking all these ideas. And I'm gonna put words in your mouth, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. But you've noticed a trend of me maybe not being nearly as optimistic as sometimes I am in the past year or so. And you think I'm overlooking some significant opportunities, and more than just me, you think many of our industry peers are doing something similar, and you've noticed a new opportunity that's actually an old opportunity that you're going to be looking into much more closely. How accurate is that?
It's accurate. And I do think, again, I don't want to downplay the fact that it isn't easy times for carbon removal. It's definitely a lot harder than it used to be in years past, and it's recently gotten a lot harder still. And I think, again, it's worth sort of like challenging some assumptions that we sort of built this industry around. And the one that I'm sort of specifically started thinking about is how carbon removal integrates with the wider VCM, clean cooking, REDD Plus, and so on. Where I think we've all sort of like had this intrinsic aversion about like associating with it. And I think in some ways, the world has moved on a couple of years. And I think in some ways, there's a recent bull run, you could say, in CDR is over. And so, yeah, I think it's time to reinvestigate a bit what's out there as well.
I think they're nice to have around because they allow us to distinguish ourselves by their failures. And I think CDR is so young that we don't have, in the same way, like the Catholic Church has been around a long time. So you can point to the Renaissance popes and be like, weren't they corrupt? And you're like, yeah, but the newer Protestant sects, usually when they've been around for a little bit of time too, some not so nice things tend to happen to them as well. They just haven't had, millennia to collect all the scandals. But CDR has some of those same tendencies. And one thing I've said on shows recently is that my previous company, Nori, was a carbon removal registry and marketplace. And we looked at the legacy players and even called them the legacy players. It's a pejorative framing that says that they're old and they're not that good, or like the next thing that's much better and more tech forward. And the longer I did this work, the more sympathy I had for basically all of them, where I'm like, not only are we no ethically better than these people, we also perform worse in some regards. And the product that we have created, you can understand the failures of those other players and be like, yeah, it's a systemic structural thing. It's not just you have to want it more or be more innovative. Some of these things are just, you all end up in the same place because you're all trying to solve the same problem and there's constraints and you work with them. And I had more mercy for them the longer I worked, where I used to be kind of a jerk about it. And I think that's true of carbon removal in general. It sounds like you've independently come to that conclusion and are saying, yeah, why are we spending all this time in this like really small space when there's a much bigger VCM to play in that we've been ignoring? I think I'm kind of channeling you a little bit.
Absolutely. No, and I get it, right? Like, I'm CEO of a DAC company, and I'm super proud of that. I'm super proud that we produce some of the world's best carbon credits with meaningful benefits too, and we do something fairly unique doing DAC in Kenya. And again, I will happily debate some biochar person why 1,000 years permanence matters. Like, I'm that kind of person. But I think it's more recently that, like, I think I got to reassess that, again, we're not like a baby anymore. We're a toddler. And you can discipline a toddler, maybe. But I think, in a sense, it's worth saying, okay, well, we're 5 years old. And the sort of question to ask is how much of the carbon removal that has been contracted is going to get delivered, right? Is it going to be 100%? Is it going to be 50%? Is it going to be 10%? And if it is going to be, say, less than 50%, like, where is our Guardian article, right? Like, in some ways, like, delivering high quality credits is hard. And I think that's something that well-intentioned people in the quote unquote legacy VCM have sort of realized for a long time. And I think we're in some ways just kind of like realizing this, where again, you have to move physical things by and large to sort of issue carbon credits. And yeah, that is hard. And especially it's hard in sort of like a sort of world that's gotten used to scaling curves that maybe are sort of more linked to things that are non-physical. And so I think that's in part like what this comes down to. And I think it's part of why I sort of recently questioned my own assumptions. And again, I would say it's my own assumptions, but here's the thing. And I think carbon removal people like to complain a lot that we don't have enough buyers, basically, right? And I told this to you that, like, in some ways, it's as if it's the buyer's fault that they don't want our products, right? And I think that's still like a cliche saying about like bad startups, right? Bad startups blame their customers. And I think it's worth mentioning that there's definitely some sort of pure play carbon removal buyers, like maybe mixing low and high durability carbon removal. But the vast bulk of people who buy carbon removal today happily buy clean cooking credits and other credits alongside that, and don't think of that as a contradiction. And so I think, yeah, it's that's sort of like something that I realized in some ways, that I think the world might not sort of go in an instant from paying $25 per ton of carbon credits to $250 per ton of carbon credits. And I think that's something that we have to maybe think a bit more about, like what that transition is going to look like, and maybe not treating the other side as an enemy, which again is maybe not the best way of starting a dialogue. But that seems to be more or less what we have done in the past couple of years, building this industry in parallel. But yeah, that's sort of like some of the early thinking that I have on this, and yeah, keen to wander over a bit.
Yeah, so many good insights in there. Thinking about how personality and childhood development works, where it's like toddlers and teenagers do a thing where they really start saying, no, I'm independent of my parents. I'm going to make some of my own decisions. They'll even say things like, I don't want the cheese from you. I want it from daddy. And you're just like, it's the same cheese. And like, who cares? Can you just eat the cheese? But when you're very young, you don't even necessarily understand yourself as different from your mother. If you have a mother, like you consider yourself almost a single unit. And then like learning that is not actually the truth of how reality works is a big part of development. And CDR is just at this point too, where we've like come out about saying like, we're different from the BCM. And then maybe we're at the point now where we're in adolescence, teen, maybe in this metaphor, if we're going to abuse it a little bit further, we'll be deeper into your 20s or 30s where you realize that your parents are frail people that have their own difficulties, who didn't have all the answers ever. And it's time to forgive them for their mistakes and make your peace with them before they die.
Wow. It's gotten very deep very quickly, Ross. I like that. Yeah.
This is the show that you love, man. This is why I do.
Yes, exactly.
So are we at that stage? Are we trying to say like, hey, we've been really mean to Verra and Gold Standard and ACR and some of these players, and maybe the time has come to learn from them, work from them, and try to figure out how CDR can fit into players that have a lot more experience than we do?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? And it's also worth noting, again, it's not like there isn't bad things out there, basically, right? There's a lot of like carbon credits, and I think those rightly get criticized. But I think if you look at some of the sort of more recent data, like Verra and others published a lot around this, like that quality has actually gone up fairly quickly in recent years, basically, right? And there is AA rated clean cooking credits now, not just there's BB rated biochar credits. Like the distinction between durable CDR and like all other carbon credits isn't inherently one of quality. Yes, it might be one of use case, and I think we can sort of like discuss what the use case is of different credits. And I think long term, very much the world should aim to have like for like offsetting for all sort of like fossil CO2 emissions. But again, I think it's let's say optimistic to think that will happen overnight. And again, I do think that there is definitely like mistakes to learn from, right? And I think one of them definitely is that, again, I think when money is plentiful, optimism abounds. And I think that sort of has been the case in the sort of traditional BCM before, whether it's like prior to 2008 or like sort of more in like 2020, 2021 type timeframe, basically. And in many ways, that's also like the founding moment of carbon removal. We were founded sort of like, well, as an industry more or less since say 2021, 2022, thereabouts, when money was everywhere. And it was a great time to start a company and think you'll sort of like be huge next year. But then the contrast between 2022 and 2024 and 2026, for those of us who've been building for that time, has been pretty stark. And you can argue, okay, so which of those years is normal? Like is the sort of like plentiful post-pandemic money, is that normal? Is the ultra-ambitious Biden climate policy normal? Or is this closer to normal, at least what normal has been like for the past 15 years or so? And maybe this is just what it looks like to actually build a carbon business now. And again, that is hard. And again, I think that's also where lots of other projects have floundered. So I would say I think maybe just starting school. I don't know, like I'm not quite sure how fast I can stretch this metaphor of like childhood. But I think it's an interesting time to maybe like stop and reflect a bit, basically, how essentially like we can come together, because ultimately we care about the same things, of course, right? That's just a really key thing. And again, knowing some of the folks that work in that market, they're good people. Again, I think there's very few actual fraudsters out there. There's a lot of well-intentioned people that are always optimistic, but guess what? We have them too. And I would go as far as saying I'm probably one of them too. And so, yeah, that's some of the reflections I have there.
What does that mean for your business? Are you trying to look into being on other registries? Is there some other pathway that gives you access here? What's the status of your operational business work with this regard?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And of course, I want to keep this practical too. I do think that I'm keen to explore new types of buyers. And that's the sort of like the types of registries that sort of didn't as naturally come into car removal as others. There's a lot of, like, I think if you look at the folks that channel a lot of car removal demand, they only do car removal because they really have conviction behind that. And that's good. And I think we need those like intermediaries, and a lot of them are Octavia's customers. But there is also like a large field of sort of, again, VCM players that are sort of much more broadly active. And I think all of them interested in car removal, but we haven't necessarily made it easy for them to engage with us if all we do all day is kind of like trashing like what they have to sell. And I do think, again, some of them are now our customers. Atmosphere, which is a German registry, is one of them. Climate Impact Partners is another. Those folks bought their first DAC credits from us, and in like some ways, even their first durable car removal credits. And I think there's, again, maybe something to like us doing DAC in the Global South, which is still quite unique, that maybe is more of a natural bridge to the sort of Global South focus that a lot of these folks have. That's the reason why there's a South and South Pole, is that that's sort of what their focus always was. And yeah, I think ultimately, I think it's engaging that type of buyers, because here's the thing, like, and I think this is something I've also realized more recently, is that we tend to panic a lot about the number of buyers there are, right? Like, apparently there's about 200 corporates that have ever bought carbon removal. I think there's more, but here's the important insight. There's about 35,000 corporates buying carbon credits, and there's about 3 million individuals who do it. I used to buy clean cooking credits myself to offset my personal carbon footprint, because I thought that's quite important. Cleaning up after yourself isn't like a crazy thing to me. And I don't think that these folks will naturally be allergic to buying, like, you know, carbon removal. I think it's just in some ways we haven't actually talked to them. And again, I think that in some ways also translates, and this is quite important, to the compliance markets, which seem to be actually taking off a lot more, much as I was very skeptical about them for a while. And yeah, so if I can just go into that too.
Go ahead.
The thing I've realized is that I was very skeptical about, say, Corsia, about Article 6.2, 6.4, and so on. When are they ever going to channel real demand? And again, for the longest time, I think this reality seemed to bear that out. And basically until 2026, there was basically just Guyana who was like issuing a bunch of credits into Corsia. But then even in just of Q1 this year, without me realizing, without me seeing it being discussed much in our space, like there were lots of Corsia eligible credits that came online all of a sudden. And Corsia now looks like it'll channel something like 60 million tons of carbon credit demand each year. And there's already like 30 million tons of supply that is getting into that, which is big. It probably means that the carbon markets as a whole, including carbon removal, will actually grow this year. And again, that's not necessarily something you see in the mood of the carbon removal sector right now. Because here's the thing, we're still a small share of that wider like VCM, much as, again, we like to trash it for being small, but like that's just the reality where we've actually gotten to with real revenue, recognized deliveries, that's sort of like recognized revenue in the sort of financial statements. And surely, like, and then again, this goes farther, like Article 6.4 has issued the first credits, like that international sort of trading scheme, with some clean cooking credits, from Myanmar to South Korea that have been sold recently. 6.2 sort of like is ratcheting up the sort of like purchasing from places like Singapore and Switzerland and others. And I'm not saying that it's sort of easy to sell carbon removal into those markets tomorrow, but what's encouraging is that the willingness to pay in these markets is sort of well out of trash credits territory. Like we're in the sort of like $20 to $30 per ton space, basically, which if you think about it, if you sort of approach sort of carbon credit portfolios with a portfolio approach, that actually leaves space for carbon removal in those sort of average prices that are being paid there right now. And I think that's something that I want to sort of like devote more of my time to, actually talking to compliance buyers, talking to other VCM buyers, and actually seeing, hey, can we actually come together and like be part of these portfolios? And in some ways, that's not a new insight, right? Like the Oxford offsetting principles have been all about this for a long time. I'm just not sure that like we've been comfortable talking to folks in those sectors, and I have some ideas why, but yeah, that's sort of like some of the ideation thoughts.
I'd love to hear some of these reasons. The two that I can hear you identifying already, one part of it is price. and that if you average the price of durable carbon removal versus the other types of assets, maybe it gets to the willingness to pay price point that you're noticing. But the second point, which is the point that we maybe have more immediate control over, is our own behavior, how we're discussing our work, how we consider it against the work of others. And you think that's a major thing that's holding us back. Feel free to comment on any of those. But then I think you're saying that you see some additional reasons too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I do think that, again, this is something I thought about more recently, which is almost by definition, a lot of the avoidance and reduction sectors are primarily based in the global south. Like there's not much clean cooking in the US because, again, it just wouldn't make sense. And I think the carbon removal sector, for better or worse, is still sort of much more global north centric than based in the global south. And maybe those worlds intersect a bit more in, say, Kenya, which is both a very vital, carbon removal sector, and also like a very well-established sort of like carbon reduction sort of space with, again, clean cooking companies issuing AA rated carbon credits. And I think that again, in some ways, is might be a reason why we're not talking more, basically. And I think, again, like the dismissiveness might come from a level of unfamiliarity as well. Again, I'm not sure how many people, say, listening right now actually know somebody who, say, is in the founding team of a clean cooking company. But yes, I think, to your point, I think we've also made it hard for ourselves. I've just talked to a clean cooking founder this week, sort of mulling this over a bit more, basically. And yeah, I think they sort of, we've lost a lot of goodwill from them, let's just say. And if not, and I think they feel very strongly that, like, I think the insistence on carbon removal has kind of like made life more difficult for everyone. And I think in some ways, again, we have to work towards sort of bridging that gap. Because again, I think in some ways, our success in scaling our industry and, well, like climate action more broadly, ultimately comes down to the dollars per ton willingness to pay for climate action or climate, like, neutralization, like emissions neutralization, say, with carbon removal. And again, I don't think that's going to like jump overnight. I think ultimately we have to sort of like go from the sort of, $25 per ton average that are maybe being paid right now to at some point $50 per ton average and, at some point $100 per ton and more. But the point is that you mentioned earlier, is like price matters, but I also don't think that many of the 200 sort of ish corporates that are known to buy carbon removal at some scale actually pay $200 per ton on average for their credits, basically, right? They probably pay a lot more. And again, a lot of them probably buy clean cooking credits because they really care about the benefits that it brings and the other good work that these people do. And I think, again, in some ways, it's not so much a question of like you either buy this or you buy that. It's more a question of like how can sort of different parts of your portfolio hand over to each other over time. Because, of course, I guess the thing is that we're all trying to work ourselves out of a job. And I think every person working clean cooking would love for their work not to be needed, and we would just have everyone to have clean cooking. I think everyone also knows that that'll take a while, but I guess that's part of the point here. I think that sort of naturally makes for time horizons when I think different types of credits can hand over into each other. So that's some thoughts that I have around that, I guess.
Oof. I've been guilty of this. You've been guilty of this.
Absolutely.
We'll have this. Where do you?
It's like literally just about a year ago, I was like on stage in front of a lot of investors and like splashing the sort of like the sort of total size of forward contracted volumes year on year, and I was like, you've got explosive growth, and guess what? Policy is just about to take over and will be huge by 2030. And again, I think in some ways, like a year ago, that was sort of reasonable enough assumption. I think it's also fair to say that like the number of forward contracted revenue this year is likely going to be smaller than in 2025. But even more importantly, like forward contracted revenue doesn't buy your dinner. It's for now, it's a fiction. Like all these credits have to get delivered to actually be a real market. And again, the thing is, for now, what we call the legacy market still is much larger than us in size. I think carbon removal, sort of like as far as I could guess, is starting to edge itself into like a meaningful share of the total VCM, like say 10, 20%. And likewise, it's increasingly a misnomer to just call this a VCM because, as I mentioned, a lot of it is kind of migrating into CORSIA and Article 6 and that sort of more compliance type space. But yeah, guess what? Like for all this confidence that we've had, we're still sort of smaller share of the total, basically. And much as we love calling out that this is a tiny market, again, we have to start somewhere. And I think in some ways that market is growing, whereas we're not right now. And I think in some ways it might be easier to question how can we hitch ourselves to that growth, as opposed to just kind of like still trying to convince people that they just shouldn't buy this stuff because it's dangerous and like we're the only safe pair of hands that they can trust their money to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeesh. I'm trying to ferret out how much of this is a problem of political economy. So much of carbon removal's investment is driven by venture capital dollars. And I'm trying to imagine you on that same stage, at a pitch competition, or maybe you're in a room giving the final pitch for why they should invest in Octavia. And you're like, yeah, our competitors, they're pretty good. They do some good work. We do a different kind of work and it's also valuable, but we like them too, compared to like everything that exists is we're the ones that can solve this problem. We're going to create an entirely new industry, an entirely new category that you're going to be able to own because we're first in and the best at it. Like, which of those two pitches is better? We all know it's the second. Like, it's more likely to get invested. But is the first one closer to the truth? Are we being bent by venture capital in this way?
I mean, I don't know, like, look, Octavia had a good 2025. We grew our contracted sales like 2.6x year on year to something meaningful in the millions of dollars. And I think ultimately, like, again, I think a good investor won't just like invest in hype and not what you're telling them, but in what your customers are actually doing, right? And again, I think in all this, it's also always worth to sort of kind of go back to our customers. I think, again, the fear that I have in some ways is that we're all increasingly almost like more comfortable talking about like solar radiation management, and like I have sort of mixed feelings about it, and I'm happy to talk about that. Then we are talking about clean cooking, and that's just removing us so far from where the sort of like public consensus actually is on these things, especially amongst our buyers, basically. And I do think that like we're sort of like retreating into a niche when we really should be like retreating into the mainstream. And I think there's already like a lot of familiarity around like biochar, and like people understand what durability matters. At the same time, they also don't think that you can sort of like immediately switch to only buying credits that are costing hundreds of dollars per ton, or at least very few companies would be able to do so. And again, all the sort of work that we do is right, internal carbon taxes and so on. But yeah, I think that's increasingly sort of like what I'm landing at. That's I think it's important not to kind of like sort of just preach to the converted and to like keep wondering why there isn't more people showing up for us, and actually just kind of go where that demand is. And yeah, I mean, ultimately, dollars should ideally follow demand, and that demand is there. It's not tiny. I think in some ways I'm keen to see whether we can sort of engage more with it.
I remember, unless I'm synthetically recreating a false memory here, of being at Nori and trying to look through the SBTI commitments, see who's already bought carbon credits on allied offsets or something like that, and being like, all right, how do we sell into people who have already demonstrated, cash on the barrelhead demand for carbon credits? How do you get around the messaging of telling them what they've bought is not real? They need to replace it all with what you're selling, which is funny that I remember thinking that, because obviously the better way to sell that is, we've already bought in some of these assets. Have you considered diversifying into another asset class that can make your portfolio as a whole richer, rather than telling someone that they made a mistake, which no one ever really likes to hear that much, and sort of like scolding your potential customer. So why not sell into them as like, enrich your portfolio here, do something a little bit different. It's going to bring your average price up, but it will bring these benefits, new geographies, new technology. This is good. This is like, basically I made a mistake. I don't even know like why that was my thought. I can't remember all of what happened back then, but I do remember having that thought, being like, that's never going to work. Why? Never mind. We just shouldn't even bother telling them that.
Yeah, but in some ways, again, we've had the framework here for years. And again, I think most of the people that would buy carbon credits full stop, but especially carbon removal, believe in net zero by 2050. And so I think in that sense, you can sort of like tell folks a very reasonable transition narrative, Paul, which is not that we're expecting you to sort of like pay 20 times more for your credits like overnight, but that you should sort of like start sort of like mixing that portfolio, again, Oxford principles, and essentially transition that over time. And again, ideally sort of like match that with sort of like ramping up sort of like internal carbon tax or something along those lines internally that essentially like also pays for that increase over time. And that essentially pays for the demand to bring carbon removal down the cost curve, basically. And at the same time, I think it sort of like gets you up that sort of like willingness to pay and squeezes out the other actually like avoidable emissions from your operations, right? And so I do think that like that's a type of conversation that's important to have. And I think in some ways it's also like, again, like it or not, like the way that regulators are probably going to approach this. I don't think anyone's going to like, I don't think Switzerland is going to move to 100% DAC removals tomorrow, basically, much as I think DAC is awesome and much as they think DAC is awesome. But I think that's really like the approach that I think we sort of need to take here, which is like when do these different credits head over to each other? And a lot of it really comes down to a very simple metric, like what's your dollars per ton? And as that increases, there's more room to buy carbon removal, basically.
One of the recurring jokes from this show is that people will be on and will say things like, we need all of the above. We're all directionally doing the same thing. And it's important. Sometimes I'll stop the tape and someone will be like, man, I really hate biochar. Man, I really hate DAC. Like just whatever. And you're like, why did you just say we need more of everything then? Like, why would you, I know like that's the thing that we're all meant to believe. It's the canon. You got to say the thing. But can we actually do that? I feel like we get kind of competitive with one another, both internally within carbon removal. And I suspect the competition is probably why we framed ourselves so antagonistically towards these older types of credits that we wanted to differentiate from. What does it look like for us to genuinely believe this? Like, is it possible for us to hold this in our heart and be like, clean cooking stoves compete with us on price? I'm glad it's happening. It might siphon some demand into lower price credits than what I would prefer them to buy, but it's better that they're spending any amount of money than nothing, and this is still good. And like, even the way that I framed this, like you have to coach yourself. Be like, I wish that money was mine. It's going to someone else who's technically a rival, but also if we don't fix climate change, we're all pretty screwed. So what do you do to get yourself in the right frame of mind to genuinely believe this? Or do you struggle with it?
Yeah, no, great question. And again, some people who know me might know that like I was on an impassioned debate about like why DAC is better than biochar just about a year ago. So again, it's not that I don't have conviction that we have the best
that was
credits.
Right, though. Like you guys were like, we're all friends there, and like it's like it was
yeah,
like a fun
absolutely.
thing. It wasn't mean spirited in any way.
And again, I mean, maybe that's part of the answer here as well, basically, right? Like, I think we can still debate on what good looks like, right? And I think accept that reasonable people can come to different conclusions here, basically, right? I think something that like sort of carbon reduction advocate would always say is that ultimately, like for now at least, again, until the world hits net zero, and again, wouldn't we all love to live in that world? Like a reduction credit has a similar like effect on the atmospheric stock of CO2 as a removal credit. Of course, it needs to be a good credit, and it can't just be like guaranteed for say 20 years or so. But yeah, I think say again going back to that sort of AA rated cooking credit is what it might come down to. And I think again, if we approach things in the spirit of that, then I think it would also be easier to just kind of like think about frameworks in which these things can actually like hand over to each other. And again, I get the problem, right? Which is that like climate capital is scarce, right? Like we can all sort of like say like all of the above as much as we want. Basically, at the end of the day, there is going to be a buyer, and there's not that many of them that is going to decide A or B and how much towards each. But again, I think in some ways, having again like just imagine the way that I think say biochar people would. Hopefully, again, maybe that's also wishful thinking, like say of DAC, that like it has a role to play, that is important, and like those people are doing good work. Just imagine if we had some clean cooking folks saying that same thing about like CDR basically, right? And again, maybe some of these things can hand over into each other sort of more neatly. There's a lot of like soil carbon, as you might well know, that sort of like has a lot of links to biochar and ERW for that matter, and so on. And I think increasingly it's some of the same people that are doing that kind of work. And so, yeah, I don't think it's necessarily like it shouldn't be as hard to divide. And again, I think in some ways, I think if we're sort of fixated on competing about the tiny pot of money that is on the table today, I mean, we'll all just lose basically, right? I think if anything, like the point for everyone is that like that pot needs to increase in size. And again, now it is increasing in size basically, right? And so I think at a minimum, we should sort of like think as a carbon removal industry about like, how we can actually sort of like, realistically start selling it to some of those channels, right? Like Article 6.4, say, and like, like Corsia for that matter. And I don't know that we do enough thinking about that yet. And again, I don't want to like talk down on the thinking that's being done here. I know that lots of people are doing good work on this in carbon removal, but clean cooking credits is what's currently sells there, and even REDD Plus and others. And I don't think I'll ever sort of fully get over the sort of like strong thinking I have about the sort of reasons why those are not as good as that. But I don't think anyone gets confused. I think people get that, like, it's capturing CO2 from the atmosphere, measuring it to the milligram, storing it as rock underground is like a different thing from like, avoiding some emission somewhere. But yeah, I think ultimately like, I think that sort of like collaboration might be important. And I think again, in some ways it might just start from talking to some other people doing that kind of work. And I've tried personally to like reach out to more folks and just kind of trying to understand them. And, maybe this is maybe like slightly like rose tinted glasses, but like maybe we can even learn something from them. I don't know. They've definitely been around for longer than us. Yeah.
There's this model of the CEO as the believer in chief, the person who just like knows this in their heart to be true. And investors love this person because they know that person's going to be tenacious and never give up and not question themselves. And this model of the leader is someone who is thoughtfully engaged with rivals or different asset classes that compete, or at the very least maybe distract away from the narrative you're trying to tell. And is it hard to lead while also being ecumenical in this way? Do you feel like employees or colleagues of yours try to look to you to think that what you're doing is literally the most important thing in the world that you personally could be doing right now? And then some of your generosity of spirit here might read as weakness or as uncertainty or doubt. Do you ever struggle with that, or not really?
I would call it confidence. So again, I think I think if you feel the need, like say you go into that pitch and you say like, here's all those reasons why those other guys are trash, basically, and let me tell you why I'm so much better than them, basically, right? In some ways, that doesn't signal confidence. It signals some sense of insecurity, basically, that like you feel a need to talk more about your competitors than you talk about your own product, basically, right? And if your product actually addresses a real need, then like very often, like people are sort of open to talk to others, basically, in the same space. I think, again, thinking, say, renewables here, I don't know that like people in solar and wind necessarily felt the need to trash each other, basically, even though they are different technologies and have different uses and different sort of like,
they probably do, let's be real. But
yeah, I wonder. I definitely know people who used to do both, at least on some sort of project developer front. But yeah, I mean, I think you could argue that like, again, 20 years ago, what mattered is not like how much like sales wind had versus solar, basically, but like that growing that tiny pot that they both drank out of, to just actually have renewables markets, basically, and like just telling people why renewables is important. And again, I do think that I do believe in the intrinsic need for carbon offsetting. Like I bought these credits myself at some point before, and so I would probably disagree with some folks in the industry that are kind of like baffled why anyone buys carbon removal. I do think that there is like real sort of like moral sense to cleaning up after yourself, and that's fairly deeply ingrained in lots of people. And again, is this billions of people? No, but it's millions of people. And I bet that there's like millions of people, more tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions, that like see something like climate neutrality and sort of like feel positively towards that, and brands that seek to achieve that, and brands that have these types of commitments. And so, yeah, I ultimately think that like the winning condition is that, basically like having enough confidence to say that like, polluters, and that includes all of us, should pay for their emissions, basically. And again, we probably shouldn't expect them to like, impoverish themselves right away, but like, essentially like to do what they can towards, I think just like cleaning up after themselves.
The person you described who says that, why does anyone buy carbon removal, or this thing, I don't get it. I say this one a lot, and it baffles me. And I'm wondering how much of that is, do you know the line, we don't see the world as it is, but as we are. I'm like, how much of this is me projecting out from my own selfishness or my inability to unilaterally do the act of goodness that I'm expecting of everyone else, and saying, none of us is voluntarily ever going to do this to the scale that is necessary. And I'm also looking like, yeah, there are things that I could be doing, but I'm not. And just like forgiving myself for my shortcomings, which can be an act of mercy, but then also being like, no one in the world is ever going to do the right thing. We're always just going to be like these self-motivated actors who are looking out for their own economic well-being, and they're not going to do these things that we need them to do. And I don't know, am I like creating a self-fulfilling prophecy here by saying that there's not a good reason to do this, and then fewer people are doing it because they're like, yeah, if everyone's selfish and no one's going to do this except for me, why should I do this thing? But there are plenty of people out there who keep the faith and are just like, I believe in doing this thing because it's the right thing to do. And if everyone else is still not doing this, then that's something that they need to answer for within themselves. I shouldn't degrade myself by falling to their level, essentially. What am I doing? Why do I keep saying this line? Am I making some grievous error? Now you can really correct me. Give me the like, tell me what I'm doing wrong with myself.
No, and I thought for a long time that it would be amazing to just do a straw poll of the entire carbon removal industry. How many folks have actually bought carbon credits before, or carbon removal for their own emissions, for that matter, basically. And, in some ways, at least as a sort of like startup founder, I get it. Like, I don't have a ton of spare cash flow, as you can probably guess. But like, again, I think in some ways, that has to be a question. Like, is what we're solving like a science and technology problem, or is it a market problem? And to what extent are we solving one versus the other, basically? Because yes, I think the science and technology are definitely advancing, and that fills me with joy. And we do a lot of like R&D with our 45 engineers at Octavia. They're doing amazing work. But again, I think a lot of this also comes down to actually like solving a market problem. And I think it's just actually understanding sort of why people buy and growing that. And I don't think it's outlandish to say that that's good and the right thing to do. Like, the vast bulk of the global GDP is covered by some type of net zero commitment. And so, yeah, I think that sort of like would be my sense there. Like, I don't think that we're just like projecting this outward. And I think in some ways, like, not believing in ourselves, but I think we do have to sort of like think of this as more than a science problem, basically, right? And I think also like working on ways of connecting with people. I know like saying abstract things like this is much easier than actually like getting cash through the door, and trust me, I know that very well. But yeah, I do genuinely think that like we might find that if we sort of like, actually like strike up good conversations with folks working in other parts of this market, basically, and asking, hey, who are your buyers? Like, do you mind introducing me to some of them, basically? That you might just find that, hey, they actually care about what like we do over here in carbon removal as well. They might actually be a good audience for something like this. And yeah, I think that's ultimately where we want to get to.
Trying to think of exactly how to ask this.
Don't be diplomatic, Ross.
No, it's not. It's more just like a big question, not like a hard or pointed one.
All right.
It's like, what I'm trying to say. What is it exactly? One way of looking at humanity's place in the universe is to say, like, we're all so small. Your individual actions don't matter at all, and therefore your individual selfishness, who cares? You're just as bad as everyone else, and you can catch glimpses of that all the way up to the presidency if you want. But also it might be the case that because this is your life, it's literally all you control. It's actually the most important thing in the world, that what you control, that you act with more integrity than you're probably acting with right now. Not you personally, but everyone. So why aren't we doing that? One thing I respect is that Sebastian Manhart's made a big deal about, like, we should probably be dog fooding this and consuming our own carbon credits, and we're all traveling around the world going to the same conferences and schmoozing. And who is actually buying credits and doing this? And the answer is not that many people, because it's really expensive. And like, we expect people to buy this from us for the same thing, but we often aren't willing to do it ourselves. And, physician, heal thyself. We're just not the kind of people that we maybe think that we are. And what are we meant to do, given that we work in a care-based industry, or what I think is a care-based industry? Are we just as hypocritical as everyone else?
It's a great question. And again, I pretty fiercely don't believe that individuals can't make a difference. And again, I mean, think yourself, like, happy to say this on air, but like Octavia wouldn't exist without me picking up the sort of carbon removal enthusiasm from the Reversing Climate Change podcast all the way back from 2020. And without that, there would be, possibly like a lot fewer people working on DAC in Kenya, or maybe things would have gone otherwise, who knows, ultimately, right? But yeah, I do think that like, these things are important. And to your point of like, are we hypocrites? I mean, I don't think necessarily, right? Like, I think most markets have like a set of early adopters that like are sort of like a better fit for technology than sort of others. Like, again, it's not like when solar cells were invented, like people started by putting them on their rooftops, but like they had very specific use cases, like the space station that could actually justify that kind of expense. I don't think people at that point were like blaming each other for not putting solar on their roofs. But I think ultimately, like, we want to sort of like, I think, approach the market that there is already, basically, right? And I think, again, in some ways, we may still just be scratching the surface of it. And I think integrating that storytelling, I think, matters a lot. I think that, to me, is like the, again, best way of breaking out. And again, I'm not saying that, hey, I've found the panacea, here's how we're going to solve carbon removal, right? Like, I think there is tough years ahead, and I think there is like a lot of like important long-term policy work ahead, and a real grind in bringing tech down the cost curve and so on. But at the end of the day, like, hey, we need buyers. And again, I think instead of trying to get those 200 people flooded with yet more like pitches from 1,000 CDR companies, why don't we actually reach out to the 35,000 that are buying this? And this might not be Microsoft. It might be some neighborhood SME that you might like do your shopping in. I think ultimately like that is the real backbone of the market that exists today. I wonder, and this is genuine interest that I would have, is like how much of that VCM as it exists today, those $500 million a year or so that gets spent on carbon credits year on year, again, not just forward contracts, but actual money changing hands. Like, how much of it is Microsoft? How much of it is Netflix, Apple, and others? And again, here's a factoid as well. Apple and Netflix haven't especially like caught the sort of like the carbon removal bug, basically. There's definitely like still folks even in that sort of like, tech bubble and so on that are maybe still more focused on other types of credits than we maybe would like them to. And so I think, again, in some ways, here's an idea. I don't claim any property to it. I hope that maybe by putting it out there, then some people will have some more useful insights on the back of it. And ultimately, I do think that that's how we grow, basically. Like discussing ideas of podcasts and seeing if they lead somewhere.
I respect this approach so much. I respect that you were willing to come out and say, I've done this thing, I think it's now was incorrect. I'm sort of like broadly sorry that I characterized it this way. And then I also like the free sharing of ideas that is potentially good for everyone. That's not something that you are the only person who will benefit from. I think that's a really beautiful, cool thing to do for the industry. And I also like that you are being genuinely creative about this. I don't know that I've heard anyone say, what if we doubled back and brought carbon removal back into the parents that we scorned way back when, and we actually reconciled and tried to become a family again. And that means working together and not contrasting ourselves so heavily against them and their failures, but trying to forgive their failures, accept them as people who are genuinely trying their best, like most parents, and trying to come together and become a family again. I think all of those things together makes what you're doing a really important act of leadership. And I'm not just saying this just to be flattering. I would even say this to you off the air, but sincere kudos, man. I respect what you're trying to do, Martin. It's a good idea, and thanks for pinging me, being like, we should talk about this right away. Yeah, you are correct. Let's do it.
Yes. No, I mean, I think, again, I think the past 2 weeks have been a bit turbulent for anyone sort of like working in carbon removal. So I think it's a good time to challenge our assumptions and maybe think outside the box a bit. And again, like it or not, like these guys actually building the infrastructure that I think all of us agree that we will need to scale. Like, I think carbon removal will work on those same sort of Article 6 rails that sort of like that quote unquote legacy market is now building for us, right? And
a new term for them, by the way.
Yeah, and I've really like wondered what to call them, because like you would call them like the VCM, but VCM increasingly isn't the right term. Is it just like the sort of offset market, the offsetting, but the, you know, like maybe that includes us as well. I'm not quite sure. If you have a good term, then I'm happy to hear it. But yeah, I think ultimately, like, again, I think in some ways, all of us want that sort of Article 6, that Corsia market, to one day be carbon removals only. And again, I think long term, you know, many people working in clean cooking might agree, because again, they want everyone to cook cleanly. And again, maybe it's optimistic to think that like that sort of will be fully done as a job to be done by, say, 2050, when we want carbon removal to fully take over. But hey, I think maybe that's a way to approach things, basically, right? And again, I do think that at the minimum, like right now, we're just kind of like leaving this field wide open. I'm not quite sure that we are actually like proposing a very like attractive framework in which like those sort of like compliance-driven markets that actually exist today, not just ones that we would like there to be, but like ones that exist today and actually like moving, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars, I believe. Like we might as well just kind of see if like we can find a way to actually like smuggle some carbon removal in there, and then just kind of like have it grow as part of that, because we all agree that that's going to be needed at some point. So yeah, something I'll sort of try to do a bit of thinking on. If again anyone listening that has more idea about it, I'd love to brainstorm. I also know in some ways that like I'm sort of like easier doing diagnosis here and actually like providing very actionable solutions. I don't have like 10 buyers for you if you're listening and would like me to, sorry. But at the minimum, I hope that we can reach out to more people. And again, maybe actually find that they might be more receptive than we realized all this time.
Well, it sounds like if you want to work on this issue rhetorically or operationally or both, Martin's your guy. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for being here, Martin. I'm really grateful that you've been a listener for so long. I'm grateful for even minor attribution of pulling you into carbon removal from the podcast.
It's not minor.
Not minor. I'm so honored. Nothing pleases me more than a statement like that. And thank you. I'm glad you pitched me on doing this. It was a great show.
Amazing. Thanks, folks. Bye.